What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my week 1 running back rankings, my top 40. I've already gone through my start sits. Now it's time to actually rank these specific running backs. Now, obviously, these are going to be a little bit related to my overall rankings, heading into the season, but there's going to be some matchup, things that make this interesting. Also, some potential injuries I want to point out here. If you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Any fantasy questions, drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the rankings. And I have a pretty clear tier 1. These are my big 3 running backs. It's Christian McCaffrey, it's Bijan Robinson, it's Breece Hall. Not all these guys have great matchups. Breece going up against the 49ers is tough, but these guys were just my set it and forget it top 3. Regardless of matchup, these dudes are going to be locked in my lineup. Christian McCaffrey has been dealing with a calf injury. I don't think that's going to affect him. He should be good to go. He's been rested, not worried at all about CMC this week. Then looking at tier 2, these are like pretty much the rest of my running back ones. We have Jahmyr Gibbs, who has been dealing with a hamstring injury, but he should also be good to go. The Lions actually have the most implied points this week, so Vegas thinks they're going to run up the score. I like Jahmyr Gibbs here as my running back 4. He was my running back 4 heading into the season. The Rams were tough against the run last year, but with no Aaron Donald, I don't really think that's going to stick. So Gibbs number 4, Jonathan Taylor at number 5, Achane at number 6, very in on Achane. Obviously, if you had Achane ranked at like running back 10, 11 coming into the year, that's probably where he'd be. But Achane was my running back 5, so I definitely like him here as like a mid-tier running back 1. Then we have Saquon Barkley going up against the Packers. We have Josh Jacobs against the Eagles. It's not a great matchup there for Josh Jacobs, but I do think early on in the season, you have A.J. Dillon, who's out for the year. You have Marshawn Lloyd, who's been dealing with an injury throughout training camp. He's just now practicing again. So there's really just not another running back out there to split with Josh Jacobs. So I think he's going to handle a really solid workload, which is why I do have him ranked fairly highly, even in a tough matchup. Then we have Rachaad White, who I'm not a massive fan of in redraft, but the Commanders allowed the second most points per game to running backs last year. You also just look at Rachaad White. He was the workhorse last year. His biggest competition is Bucky Irving, who's a rookie. So I think if Bucky Irving is going to eat into Rachaad White's usage, it's probably going to be throughout the season. Week 1, I feel like Rachaad White is going to handle a really solid workload and be a nice fantasy running back 1. Then we have Joe Mixon, another guy where maybe he loses work throughout the year, but week 1, he should be the workhorse here for the Texans. James Cook is someone who I have ranked higher this week than I did in my season-long rankings. The Cardinals allowed the most points per game to running backs in 2023. Obviously, all these things aren't going to stick. Defenses are going to improve. Some defenses are going to get worse. But typically, if you are the best defense for running backs to go against, that's not going to have a complete 180, from 2023 to 2024. So I like the matchup for James Cook. This Bills defense is going to score points, so I like him as a top 12 guy. And then shifting into my tier 3, these are honestly just like really good running backs who drew tough matchups. Travis Etienne going up against the Dolphins. Dolphins were really good against the run last year. You have Kyron Williams, who is going up against the Lions. They have allowed the fewest points per game to running backs in 2023. So that's a tough matchup. I also kind of, obviously if you drafted Kyron, you're going to play him. I am very interested in seeing what the split is between him and Blake Corum. Has, this Blake Corum hype been a smokescreen, or, is this actually going to be a decent split? I imagine if Corum's going to work in, it's probably going to be throughout the season, not like in week 1 where he just makes his stamp. But I still think it'll be interesting to see if Blake Corum is like coming in and taking over whole drives here for the Rams. And then these next 2 running backs are going up against each other. Derrick Henry, Isaiah Pacheco. Chiefs have a great defense. Ravens have a great defense. That's why both those guys, are lower than where I'd have them in my overall rankings or like my preseason rankings. Looking at tier 4, these are just like my mid-tier RB2s. Alvin Kamara, Kenneth Walker, James Conner. These guys are all pretty close together in like my player rankings heading into the year. For Alvin Kamara, I do think he's going to handle a large workload. The Panthers were actually pretty tough against opposing running backs last year, which is pretty impressive considering the fact that they were like not competitive in games. So typically if you're getting like blown out and teams are able to just like run out the clock on you, running backs are going to perform well. They really didn't, but I do think early on in the season, Kamara is going to have a large workload. Kendre Miller, not going to be here for the early part of the season. So there's really just not a ton of other options. I do think Taysom Hill is going to work in. I think he's going to get his fair share on the ground. But I think workload-wise, Kamara is going to be in a good spot to start off the year. Then we have Kenneth Walker. And the Broncos were pretty rough at stopping opposing running backs last year for fantasy, but they definitely got better towards the end of the season. If you guys remember when Achane and Mostert just like went berserk, I think the Dolphins dropped like 70 points. That was against the Broncos. So their numbers against running backs have been kind of skewed. They did improve throughout the year. So I don't think it's like a smash matchup for Kenneth Walker. I'm just really interested in seeing what the Seahawks offense looks like. What is going to be the wide receiver alignment? Is JSN going to be in on 2 wide receiver sets? How much work is Zach Charbonnet going to take from Kenneth Walker? So just very interested in seeing that offense. And then the final guy in this tier, James Conner. I just think he's a nice mid-tier RB2 option. I think the risk of drafting James Conner is he starts to lose work to Trey Benson. But in week 1, I just don't really think that's a massive concern. Then looking at tier 5, these are pretty much like my back-end running back 2s. I guess like mid to back-end RB2s. Start off with Aaron Jones. We'll be interested to see, what the split is between him and Ty Chandler. Not a super scary matchup against the Giants. Then we have David Montgomery. Like I mentioned for Jahmyr Gibbs, the Lions have the highest implied points. Not overly scared of this Rams run defense without Aaron Donald. Then we have Raheem Mostert. Even though I really like Achane, I do think the Dolphins are going to feed at least 2 running backs. Raheem Mostert was a stud last year. If he starts to fall off and lose work, I think it's going to be throughout the season, either with an injury or just with bad play. But week 1, I think he's going to have fine usage. Then we have Ramondre Stevenson, and I like Ramondre as the player, but the Patriots have by far the fewest implied points this week, so Vegas does not have a ton of confidence in their offense. I don't really know how anyone would have confidence in their offense, so back-end RB2 is probably where I settle here. I will say, though, he can catch passes, so even though in a game script where they're trailing, I still think he could be useful, especially in like PPR formats. Then we have Zamir White as like a back-end RB2. Pretty interested in seeing what the Raiders running back usage is. I do think he's going to be the clear running back 1, but is he involved at all as a pass catcher? On an offense that's a little bit suspect, how many touchdown opportunities are there actually going to be for Zamir White? So I think this week will be fairly telling. Not overly concerned about the game script, even though the Chargers are favorites. They're not like massive favorites, so I'm not overly worried about Zamir White getting like phased out of the game in favor of like Madison or Lauby. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be DeAndre Swift. I don't know if he's always going to be up here in like the top 24, but it's a decent matchup here against the Titans. I think the Bears are like the 6th or 8th in implied points, so Vegas thinks they're going to score. If they're scoring, playing well, Swift is probably paying off for you, especially early on in the season where he's the guy that signed the big money. He's going to have a role early on. It's just a matter of if he's good enough to maintain it throughout the rest of the year. Then moving over to tier 6, this is going to be a very large tier. I believe we have 11 guys here. And this is kind of just the area of like the ambiguous backfields, the committees. We're not quite sure what the usage is going to be. When we start off with Javonte Williams here, I've continued to warm up more and more when it comes to Javonte. You just look at this backfield. Piron's gone. I think Javante's clearly the most talented guy if he does get an efficiency bounce back, a full season removed from his torn ACL. So I think he'll be involved as a pass catcher. He should be their like early down guy also. So I like him here as a high-end running back 3, but definitely still some uncertainty with that backfield. Then I have Zach Moss and Chase Brown, and this may seem high for like a projected 50-50 split, but in a game where they have the 6th highest implied points and they're 9.5-point favorites, this is probably going to be a pro running back game script where they're running it out to end the game. And I think that slightly favors Zach Moss. Like I think when we're looking at the usage, Zach Moss is probably going to be more the early down grinder, the goal line guy, Chase Brown more of the receiving back. So if the Bengals were trailing, I think that game script would probably favor Chase Brown. If they're ahead, it probably favors Moss. But I think both these guys are like fine running back 3 options, just, given the matchup and them being big favorites. Behind those two, we have Devin Singletary going up against the Vikings. I'm pretty confident that Singletary is going to have a strong workload. It's just the question of like, can this Giants offense actually do anything? Like, will that workload matter? I think week 1, like a higher end RB3 slot is pretty fair. Then we have the Steelers backfield committee, Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren. I will say that, people were kind of worried about Jaylen Warren's injury. He was dealing with a hamstring strain. He practiced yesterday. He should be good to go here. I'll give Najee the slight edge, just because maybe Warren is slightly limited in week 1. But the Steelers have the 3rd fewest implied points. It's going to be tough when you have a backfield split between 2 people and the offense isn't projected to score well. So that's obviously concerning, which is why I have them here as mid-tier RB3s. Behind those two, I have Brian Robinson Jr. I actually really like B-Rob this year. I think he's a really nice option if you go like hero RB, zero RB to slot in as like one of your starting running backs. This is just a bad matchup against the Buccaneers. The Bucs, I mean, honestly, last year, previous seasons, they have just been really tough against opposing running backs. I think that's probably going to be the same thing here in week one. Then we have Jerome Ford, and I know people like Jerome Ford, especially with Nick Chubb out. This is just a tough matchup. The Cowboys have allowed the sixth fewest points per game to running backs in 2023. I think there's also still some real question marks about this Browns offense, specifically the quarterback play in Deshaun Watson. So I think in better matchups, he'll be ranked higher, but he's my number 32 this week. Then we have Chuba Hubbard right behind Ford. I am somewhat optimistic about this Panthers offense. I don't think they're going to be anywhere close to as bad as they were last year, but there are still some question marks. We're not positive Chuba Hubbard is going to be used as like the 3-down workhorse with Jonathan Brooks out. So once again, could be someone who's I have more confidence in moving forward. But week one, running back 33. Then we have the Titans committee here with Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. They're like the end of this list going up against the Bears. I just think there are question marks about this Titans offense. You're looking at a likely 50-50 split and not a great matchup here against the Bears. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the split looks like in week one, but not overly confident playing either of those dudes. Now shifting into tier 7, this is really just like gross committee situation. We're really not sure what the usage is going to look like to an even larger extent than what we saw in tier 6. So we have both the Cowboys running backs in here. I have Rico Dowdle as my running back 36, Zeke as my running back 40. It definitely seems like me being in on Rico is going to pay off. We continue to get reports that Rico Dowdle looks like the likely running back 1. Now, that's good, but in week 1 here against the Browns, it's a tough matchup. So I'm not some dude who loves Rico Dowdle, the player. I don't think he's sensational. So I'd still be worried about a tough matchup. Plus, there's probably going to be some sort of split here with him and Zeke. Then I have the Chargers running backs back-to-back, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins. I do think Kamani Vidal is going to have some juice long-term in this backfield, but early on, it's probably going to be, between these two, Edwards, Dobbins. Who really knows who takes over? I mean, Gus Edwards has been fine throughout his career. Dobbins, when healthy, is the infinitely better player, but there's no guarantee off a torn ACL, off a torn Achilles, that he is going to be, anywhere near the guy we've seen when he has been healthy. So, we'll see what that backfield looks like. And then the final guy here, Austin Eckler. Not super high on Eckler. Maybe he gets some work as a pass catching back if they're trailing, but with a mobile quarterback, not someone who I'm overly invested in this year. And that's going to wrap it up for my top 40. We really will never know less than we do right now, right? We're not sure what the splits are. We're not exactly sure how good these defenses are, how they're going to be against the run. So there's definitely a lot of question marks. Hopefully week 1 answers a lot of those questions, but let me know your thoughts. If you guys have any questions, let me know down below. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.